When a billionaire father leaves his sprawling, historic estate to his two greedy sons and nothing but a rotting, rat-infested potting shed to his youngest, it looks like the ultimate betrayal. But what the brothers didn't know was that the real inheritance wasn't the mansion. It was what lay buried beneath the dirt. The mahogany-paneled office of Theodore Higgins, the top estate lawyer in upstate New York, smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and unspoken tension. Outside, a bleak November rain lashed against the heavy glass windows, mirroring the somber reality of the day. Richard Pendleton, the eccentric patriarch of the Pendleton shipping empire, had passed away a week prior, leaving behind a fortune estimated at over $80 million. Sitting rigidly in the high-backed leather chairs were Richard's three sons. Victor Pendleton, the eldest, adjusted his custom-tailored Brioni suit, his posture reeking of impatience. As a ruthless hedge fund manager in Manhattan, Victor viewed time purely as a currency. Next to him sat Simon, the middle brother, a corporate defense attorney whose calculating eyes never stopped moving. He rhythmically tapped a silver Mont Blanc pen against his thigh, mentally inventorying the assets before the lawyer even opened his mouth. Then there was Arthur. Arthur, the youngest by nearly a decade, sat a little further away, wearing a worn corduroy jacket over a simple sweater. Unlike his brothers, who had fled the family estate the moment they secured their trust funds, Arthur had stayed. He had spent the last 5 years caring for their father as his health declined, reading to him in the cavernous library and walking with him through the sprawling, overgrown gardens of the Oakhaven estate. Arthur had never cared for the money. He cared for the man. Theodore Higgins cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. He broke the wax seal on the thick envelope resting on his desk. "Gentlemen," Higgins began, his voice gravelly, "your father was a complex man. His instructions were highly specific. I will read the distribution of assets exactly as he dictated them." Victor scoffed quietly. "Let's just get on with it, Theodore. I have a board meeting at 4. Higgins shot Victor a stern look over the rim of his glasses before reading. The division of the empire began. To no one's surprise, the lion's share of the visible wealth went to the eldest. Victor was awarded the deed to the Oakhaven mansion, a breathtaking 40-room limestone estate built in 1912, along with the controlling shares of the Pendleton shipping logistics firm. Simon was granted the entirety of Richard's liquid assets, an offshore investment portfolio, and the family's collection of vintage automobiles, a fleet worth millions on its own. Arthur watched his brothers exchange a brief, triumphant smirk. They had won. The empire was theirs to divide and conquer. And finally, Higgins continued, pausing slightly. He looked up at Arthur, a flicker of genuine pity crossing his aged face. "To my youngest son, Arthur, for his unwavering loyalty, I leave Tract 4B of the Oakhaven property." The room went dead silent. Simon stopped tapping his pen. "Tract 4B?" Victor asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What the hell is Tract 4B?" The estate was strictly zoned as a single historical parcel. Higgins shuffled a map from the file and slid it across the desk. He pointed a trembling finger at a tiny, heavily shaded square at the extreme southern edge of the property boundary. "Tract 4B is a half-acre subdivision," Higgins explained quietly. "It contains the old gardening shed and the immediate soil beneath it. Your father secretly subdivided this parcel a month before his death. The shed and the half-acre it sits upon belong entirely to Arthur. Furthermore, that is the extent of Arthur's inheritance. There is no monetary trust attached." Victor stared at the map for 3 seconds before a booming, cruel laugh escaped his chest. Simon joined in, a sharp, wheezing chuckle that filled the tense office. "A shed?" Victor gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "The old man left you the rat trap by the dead oaks. Oh, Arthur, this is priceless. I always told you that playing the dutiful, bleeding heart nurse wouldn't pay off. Dad always respected strength. You showed him weakness, and he gave you a shack." Arthur said nothing. He simply stared at the map. The shed was a dilapidated, forgotten stone and wood structure that hadn't been used since the 1970s. The roof sagged under the weight of decades of rot, and the windows were choked with thick, dead ivy. It was completely disconnected from the mansion's power and plumbing grids. "Is this a joke, Mr. Higgins?" Arthur finally asked, his voice steady but barely above a whisper. "I assure you, Arthur, it is completely legally binding," Higgins replied, looking down at his desk. "Your father was of sound mind." By that evening, Arthur was standing in the freezing rain, staring at his inheritance. The mansion loomed in the distance, ablaze with warm, golden light. Through the grand bay windows, Arthur could see silhouettes moving to the rhythm of a jazz band. Victor and Simon were throwing a lavish party to celebrate their newly acquired empire, drinking their father's most expensive vintage scotch. Arthur pushed open the heavy, rotting wooden door of the shed. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the smell of damp earth, mildew, and decaying wood hit him like a physical blow. The beam of his flashlight illuminated rusty rakes, broken terracotta pots, and cobwebs thick as cotton candy. The roof was missing several shingles, allowing cold rain to drip steadily onto the warped floorboards. He had $20 in his checking account, a duffel bag of clothes, and a leaking shed. It was the ultimate insult. But as Arthur sat on an overturned bucket in the freezing dark, listening to the distant laughter from the mansion, a strange sense of resolve washed over him. He knew his father. Richard Pendleton was a genius, a historian, and a master of puzzles. He didn't do anything by accident. The first week was agonizing. Arthur spent his days scrounging for discarded building materials in the local scrapyards, using what little cash he had to buy a heavy-duty tarp, a kerosene space heater, and a cheap camp cot. He patched the massive holes in the shed's roof, shivering through the bitter New York nights. His brothers made his life as miserable as possible. Victor, reveling in his new power as the lord of the manor, had the estate's security guards build a chain-link fence separating the mansion's pristine grounds from Arthur's muddy half-acre. On a Tuesday afternoon, Victor strolled down to the fence line, wearing a plush cashmere overcoat and holding a steaming mug of coffee. He watched Arthur hammering a piece of salvaged plywood over a broken window. "You're an absolute embarrassment, Artie," Victor called out over the fence, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "The neighbors are starting to ask why the heir to the Pendleton fortune is living like a vagrant in my backyard." Arthur didn't miss a beat with his hammer. "It's my backyard, Victor. Legally." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Enjoy the technicalities while you can. I've already spoken to my architects. We're expanding the outdoor patio, and I want a new tennis court right where that eyesore is sitting. I'm taking you to court to challenge the subdivision of this land. I'll bleed you dry in legal fees, and then I'm bringing in the bulldozers. You have 30 days to pack up your little campsite and get off my property." Victor turned and walked back toward the warmth of the mansion, leaving Arthur with a ticking clock. 30 days. If Victor unleashed his corporate lawyers, Arthur knew he wouldn't stand a chance. He had no money for a defense. That night, a massive nor'easter rolled through the valley. The wind howled, rattling the frail walls of the shed, and the rain came down in torrents. Arthur sat huddled near his kerosene heater, when he heard a sharp crack. The weight of the wind had caused one of the heavy oak support beams near the back corner of the shed to shift, pulling the floorboards up with it. The wood groaned, and a section of the rotting pine floor collapsed entirely, revealing the dark, muddy crawl space below. Swearing under his breath, Arthur grabbed his flashlight and crept over to inspect the damage. He shone the beam into the jagged hole. The earth below was damp and covered in old leaves, but as the light swept across the dirt, a glint of dull metal caught his eye. Arthur froze. He lowered himself onto his stomach, reaching his arm deep into the freezing mud beneath the floor joists. His fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and distinctly unnatural. Gritting his teeth, he dug his nails into the dirt and pulled. With a sickening squelch, Arthur yanked a heavy, soot-blackened metal lockbox out of the earth. He sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. The box was ancient, covered in intricate brass filigree that had turned green with oxidation. The padlock holding it shut was completely rusted through. Grabbing a heavy iron crowbar from his meager pile of tools, Arthur wedged it under the latch and threw his weight against it. The lock snapped with a sharp crack. Arthur opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in a protective layer of oilcloth, were 3 items: a heavy, ornate skeleton key made of dark iron, a hand-drawn blueprint on yellowing parchment, and a sealed envelope with his name written on it. It was his father's handwriting. Trembling, Arthur tore open the envelope. "My dearest Arthur, if you are reading this, the worst has come to pass. I am gone, and your brothers have undoubtedly shown their true nature. I gave Victor the house because he only values appearances. I gave Simon the money because he only values ledgers. I gave them the illusion of wealth, Arthur, because I knew they would squander the true legacy of this family. Our wealth did not start with my shipping company. It started with your great-grandfather, Harrison Pendleton, during a time when holding wealth meant hiding it. The mansion above is beautiful, but it is empty. The real Pendleton estate was never built for the son. I leave you the shed, my boy, because it is the only key to the door. Do not let them take it. Look at the blueprints. Dig deep. Forgive an old man for testing you, but the burden of what lies below requires a quiet heart and a strong back. Love, Dad." Arthur stared at the letter, reading it 3 times before the words truly sank in. He unfolded the brittle parchment blueprint. It was a schematic of the Oakhaven estate dated 1922, but it looked entirely different from the official records. The mansion was there, but beneath the garden shed, Tract 4B, was a complex architectural drawing of a subterranean vault. The shed had never been built to hold tools. It had been built to conceal a vertical access shaft. Arthur looked at his watch. It was 2 a.m. His brothers were asleep. He had 29 days before Victor brought the bulldozers. He didn't have time to hire help. He didn't have time to overthink. Arthur grabbed his crowbar and began violently prying up the rest of the rotting floorboards. He worked in a frenzy, tossing the damp wood aside until the enter-dirt foundation of the shed was exposed. He grabbed a rusted spade he had found in the corner and began to dig. For 5 consecutive nights, Arthur lived a double life. By day, he pretended to be a defeated man, sitting quietly on his cot, ignoring the taunts of Victor and Simon, who occasionally strolled by the fence to laugh at his misery. By night, he transformed into a machine. He hung thick black tarps over the windows so the light wouldn't escape. And he dug. The physical toll was immense. His hands were torn open, covered in bleeding blisters that he wrapped in duct tape. His muscles screamed with every shovelful of heavy, rocky soil. He had to be incredibly careful, hauling buckets of dirt out and scattering them subtly into the thick woods behind the shed, so his brothers wouldn't notice the excavation. On the fifth night, at a depth of roughly 6 feet, the blade of Arthur's shovel struck something that wasn't a rock. Clang! The hollow, metallic sound echoed loudly in the confined pit. Arthur froze, terrified that the noise had carried to the mansion, but the roaring wind outside covered his tracks. Dropping to his knees, he threw the shovel aside and began clawing at the dirt with his bare, bleeding hands. He cleared away a century of compacted earth, his flashlight beam cutting through the dust. Embedded in a thick slab of reinforced concrete was a massive, riveted steel trapdoor. It looked like the hatch of a submarine, oxidized and sealed tight against the earth. In the center of the heavy iron wheel that served as the handle was a single, ancient keyhole. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the heavy skeleton key from his father's lockbox. His hands shook as he guided the key into the slot. It slid in perfectly, but as he tried to turn it, the mechanism refused to budge. Decades of rust had seized the lock. Panic set in. He grabbed a can of mechanical oil he had scavenged, flooding the keyhole, waiting agonizing minutes before trying again. He gripped the key with both hands and twisted with all his might. Click, clack. The heavy internal tumblers fell into place with a deep, echoing thud. Arthur grabbed the iron wheel, planted his boots against the concrete, and pulled upward with every ounce of strength he had left. With a deafening groan of metal scraping against metal, the heavy trapdoor gave way. It swung open, hitting the concrete with a thud that shook the ground. Arthur shone his flashlight down into the abyss. A perfectly preserved spiral staircase made of dark, polished stone descended deep into the earth. From the darkness below, a rush of cold, perfectly dry, ancient air blew upward, carrying with it a scent Arthur couldn't quite place, a mixture of old paper, aged oak, and something distinctly metallic. Arthur grabbed his flashlight, stepped onto the first stone stair, and descended into the dark. The descent felt endless. Arthur counted 42 stone steps before his boots finally hit a solid, flat landing. The air down here was remarkably different, crisp, bone-dry, and completely devoid of the suffocating rot that plagued the shed above. He swept his flashlight beam through the darkness, the narrow cone of light cutting through a century of still, undisturbed dust. What he saw made him drop his crowbar. It clattered against the stone floor, the sound echoing endlessly into the cavernous space. He was not standing in a root cellar or a simple bunker. He was standing in a massive subterranean hall, the ceiling arched high above him in a stunning herringbone pattern of interlocking terracotta tiles. Arthur recognized it immediately from his architectural studies in college. It was the unmistakable, fireproof acoustic vaulting of Rafael Guastavino, the legendary Spanish architect who had designed the hidden spaces of Grand Central Terminal and the Boston Public Library in the early 1900s. The fact that a Guastavino vault existed beneath a forgotten shed in upstate New York was a historical marvel in itself. Arthur found a heavy, industrial electrical breaker panel near the base of the stairs. Knowing the old grid was dead, he spent the next day returning to the surface, purchasing a heavy-duty portable lithium generator and carrying it down into the depths. When he finally wired it into the antique junction box and flipped the main breaker, a series of caged vintage Edison bulbs buzzed to life, illuminating the vault in a warm, amber glow. The scale of his father's secret was staggering. Lining the far wall were dozens of heavy, steel safe deposit boxes, built directly into the limestone foundation. In the center of the room sat rows of iron-banded wooden crates, their exteriors stamped with faded black ink. U.S. Assay Office, New York, 1932. Trembling, Arthur approached the nearest crate. He used his crowbar to pry the rusted iron bands loose and splintered the heavy oak lid open. Gold. Neatly stacked inside were rows of heavy, dull yellow bullion bars. Arthur's great-grandfather, Harrison Pendleton, had been a paranoid visionary. Anticipating the devastating banking collapses of the Great Depression and the subsequent Gold Reserve Act, Harrison had quietly liquidated a massive portion of the family's assets, converting them into physical gold and burying them securely off the grid. It was untraceable, tax-free, and worth a modern fortune that dwarfed the offshore accounts Simon had so smugly inherited. But the gold wasn't the true inheritance. At the back of the vault sat a pristine mahogany desk. On it rested a single, thick leather binder and a vintage fountain pen. Arthur walked over, blowing a thin layer of dust from the leather cover. Embossed in gold leaf on the front were the words, "The Oakhaven Heritage Trust." Arthur opened the binder. Inside were the original foundational documents of the Pendleton Empire, impeccably preserved, some even bearing the countersignature of J.P. Morgan's private legal counsel from the 1920s. As Arthur read through the densely typed legal jargon, a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. His father was a genius. The documents revealed a devastating legal reality. The Oakhaven mansion, the sprawling 40-room limestone estate that Victor currently occupied, was entirely legally separate from the land it sat upon. In 1922, Harrison Pendleton had transferred the deed of the physical land beneath the entire estate into a private holding company, the Oakhaven Heritage Trust. The mansion itself was merely a structure built on a century-long ground lease. And the legal corporate domicile for the Oakhaven Heritage Trust? Tract 4, B. By subdividing the property and leaving Tract 4B to Arthur, Richard had not merely left his youngest son a shed. He had left him the physical headquarters and the sole controlling proprietorship of the holding company that owned the earth beneath his brother's feet. The lease on the mansion's land had expired the exact day their father passed away. Victor owned the bricks. Simon owned the banking ledgers. But Arthur owned the chessboard. The morning of the 30th day broke with a hard, bitter frost. At precisely 8 a.m., the ground shook as a massive yellow caterpillar bulldozer rumbled up the driveway of the Oakhaven estate, its diesel engine roaring into the quiet morning. Victor and Simon stood at the edge of the chain-link fence, flanked by the estate's private security and a smug-looking county sheriff. Victor wore a bespoke camel hair overcoat, holding a thermos of coffee, his face a mask of absolute arrogance. "Time is up, Artie," Victor shouted over the roar of the idling bulldozer. 30 days. I told you I wasn't playing games. The demolition permits are signed. Get your junk out of my backyard, or it gets buried with the shed. The heavy wooden door of the shed slowly creaked open. Victor's smug smile faltered slightly. Arthur did not emerge wearing the dirt-stained corduroy jacket and worn-out boots of a defeated man. Instead, he stepped into the freezing morning air wearing a sharply tailored, charcoal-grey Tom Ford suit, purchased 3 days prior after quietly liquidating a single gold bar through a private, high-end broker in Manhattan. He looked rested, confident, and utterly unbothered. Trailing closely behind Arthur was Theodore Higgins, the estate lawyer, clutching a thick leather briefcase to his chest. "What is this?" Simon asked, his lawyer's instincts immediately sensing that something was wrong. "Higgins, what are you doing here? The estate division was settled a month ago." Arthur walked calmly to the chain-link fence, completely ignoring the massive bulldozer idling just yards away. "Good morning, Victor." "Simon," Arthur said, his voice smooth and steady. "I see you brought the demolition crew right on schedule." "Cut the act, Arthur," Victor snapped, his face reddening. "You look ridiculous. Did you max out your credit cards for a suit to get evicted in? Sheriff, remove him from my property." The sheriff took a step forward, but Theodore Higgins raised a hand, stepping in front of Arthur. "I would strongly advise against trespassing on my client's property, Sheriff," Higgins said, his voice echoing with decades of courtroom authority. "And Victor, you might want to tell that bulldozer operator to cut his engine before you find yourself facing federal property damage charges." "His property?" Victor laughed, though it sounded strained. "He owns a half-acre of dirt. I own the estate. I have the deed to the mansion right here in my pocket." "You have the deed to the structure of the mansion, Victor," Arthur corrected gently. He gestured to Higgins, who unclasped his briefcase and pulled out the thick leather binder Arthur had found in the vault. "Gentlemen," Higgins announced, holding up the century-old documents, "I have spent the last 72 hours authenticating these files with the state registry. This is the master ledger of the Oak Haven Heritage Trust. According to the foundational documents drafted by your great-grandfather in 1922, the Oak Haven mansion was built on a 99-year ground lease. The land itself belongs entirely to the trust." Simon went completely pale. He grabbed the chain-link fence, his knuckles turning white. "A ground lease? That's impossible. Dad owned the land outright." "Dad was the sole trustee of the holding company," Arthur explained, looking his brothers dead in the eye. "And as per the corporate bylaws, the trust and all its vast unregistered physical assets, which, Simon, I assure you, make your offshore accounts look like pocket change, are permanently legally tied to the corporate address." Arthur pointed back at the rotting shed. "Tract 4B. Silence fell over the frosty morning, broken only by the low rumble of the bulldozer. "The lease on the land beneath your mansion expired upon our father's death," Arthur continued, his voice devoid of any pity. "Since I am now the sole proprietor of the Oak Haven Heritage Trust, the land has reverted to me, every blade of grass, every oak tree, and the very foundation your house sits upon is legally mine." Victor stared at Arthur, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The arrogant hedge fund manager was mentally doing the math, and the devastating reality was crashing down on him. A mansion without the land it sits on is completely unsellable, uninsurable, and legally worthless. You set us up," Victor stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. "Dad set us up." "Dad gave you exactly what you valued most," Arthur replied, his tone chillingly calm. "He gave you an empty symbol of wealth, Victor. And he gave Simon a ledger of numbers. You wanted the crown, but you never bothered to check who owned the castle walls." Arthur pulled a crisp, white envelope from his tailored jacket pocket and slid it through the chain-link fence. It fluttered to the ground at Victor's feet. "What is that?" Simon whispered, terrified. "That is an eviction notice," Arthur said. "Since you are currently occupying a structure on my land without a valid lease, you have 30 days to vacate the premises. Alternatively, you can sell me the structure of the mansion. I'm willing to be generous and offer you 10 cents on the dollar." Victor looked from the envelope to the rotting shed, and finally to the man he had spent his entire life underestimating. The realization of his total, absolute defeat mirrored the bleak, freezing morning. He had nothing. Arthur turned his back on his brothers, walking away from the fence and back toward the shed. The mansion was his. The legacy was his. But most importantly, he had proven that their father's final judgment was flawless. The true foundation of the Pendleton family had finally been unearthed. Arthur's incredible discovery proves that the greatest treasures are often hidden in the most unexpected places. His brothers thought they had won the world, but they were outsmarted by a father who knew that loyalty and humility are the true markers of a worthy heir. If you were captivated by this incredible story of justice, hidden wealth, and the ultimate family plot twist, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true stories.